During the first gameplay demonstration for The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, many's hopes were dashed when Link was diving down and he hit the river and then came back up. There was no sign of him swimming around exploring the underwater. That was not seen. For many, there has been this hope that we would see the game expand to the underwater for exploration. Not just the sky, not just the surface, not just to theorize underground, but underwater as well. Some thought that they were building up to this from what we saw in Breath of the Wild, yet from what we've seen of the footage, many are thinking that underwater exploration has been deconfirmed. But today I'm here to argue otherwise. I think there's still fairly substantial evidence suggesting that there's a pretty good amount of hope for underwater exploration in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. That's what we're talking about today.
Hey, listen!
Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about how there's still hope for underwater exploration in Tears of the Kingdom. But before we jump into that, let me point out that we are aiming to hit 25,000 subscribers by the time Tears of the Kingdom comes out on May 12th. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because then we might just make it. So I'm going to break down my argument into three different categories. First, we're going to talk about why the scene at the end of the Tears of the Kingdom footage does not deconfirm underwater exploration. And then after that, we'll be going over some of the arguments that have been made before this gameplay demonstration that suggest deep sea gameplay. And then we'll be closing out by several different pieces of evidence that have come up during this footage that I think support this idea that there will absolutely be underwater exploration. So I think, at least. So please take this with a grain of salt. It has not been confirmed, but I still do feel pretty good about it. But let's now get into this first part here. So many feel that because we did not see Link explore underwater at the very end, that was a perfect opportunity to do so, and they didn't do it. If there was, Aonuma would have showed us. Especially when you consider that there was also this lake area early on in the footage where they needed a way to cross the river, and Link did not cross the river by swimming, he had to use a boat. Well, first off, let's remind ourselves that in Breath of the Wild, Link had a stamina wheel. And from what we can see of the footage, it looks like this is fairly early on into the game, and I've been speculating that it's so early on into the game that Link hasn't even upgraded his stamina one bit. It looks like we've basically just gotten through the Great Plateau equivalent in Tears of the Kingdom, where Link perhaps has obtained the 4 different power-ups and has acquired one single upgrade in the heart department as opposed to the stamina department. So because his stamina isn't very high, he can't just swim across the river, he wouldn't make it. So swimming was kept to a minimal because it just had no reason to be shown off for what was being shown off with the different abilities. Underwater exploration would actually be a fairly big expansion to the world, and they were just focusing on some abilities here. Keep in mind, they didn't even show us any underground exploration, and we've been theorizing that for quite a bit. So because they haven't shown us any underground exploration, does that mean that's also not in the game either? I don't really think that's the case. Just because there's an absence of evidence doesn't mean it's evidence of absence. So there still may be underground exploration as we've seen from the different trailers, and there still may be underwater exploration. On top of that, when Link does dive into the river, he's right next to land. We can see the ground through the water. There's only a few feet there. There isn't really much to swim under. So I don't think any of the footage deconfirms it. However, I will at least concede that at this point it's not confirmed, so it is up in the air. No pun intended there. Now before we got this footage, I was already thinking that there is a decent chance we could be seeing underwater exploration. Most 3D Zeldas have some type of gameplay that goes below the surface of a sea or a lake. And Breath of the Wild, it looks like they were considering to have underwater exploration because we've seen actually under the surface where there's quite a bit of detail, which you can't see normally. You actually have to glitch through the surface of the water to see all of this detail. Why did they bother even putting this in? There's even a chest that is not accessible underwater. This suggests that they may have been considering underwater exploration at one point or another. So adding underwater exploration again in Tears of the Kingdom doesn't really seem like a stretch. But when you also consider that they're expanding to the skies and also likely to the underground, because we've seen several different underground areas, That's a lot of expansion from a vertical perspective. The one department they would be missing would be underwater. So if they're going through the lengths and efforts to have a seamless transition between the surface and the sky, and there's all these different things you can do in the sky, and then there may also be this underground exploration, underwater doesn't really seem like that much of a stretch. Of course, it is still extra work to accomplish. Maybe they just chose to prioritize on sky stuff and not really worry about underwater stuff, because in previous games, underwater exploration wasn't even that fun. But considering that they've done it in multiple Zeldas in the past, my perspective is that they would still be willing to do it again, especially with how capable the Zelda team is nowadays. They seem to be able to come up with all sorts of solutions for all sorts of problems. I think there's a pretty good chance that the reason we couldn't go underwater in Breath of the Wild had more to do with the fact that it was time to release the game, and they just had a lot of ideas that they just weren't ready to fully realize. But now, with Tears of the Kingdom, over 6 years of development, building off of Breath of the Wild as a base, there's a lot more that they're going to have a chance to get to. Not to mention, they need more ways to remix the surface. Just throwing in a few rocks and new towers might not be enough. But if we can go underwater pretty much everywhere there is water throughout the world of Hyrule, that adds a lot more to explore. But now on to the evidence that we have observed in the most recent footage for Tears of the Kingdom. So first, I think it's important to point out that we don't know just how many powers Link has in Tears of the Kingdom. We're not even entirely sure of the goal or how linear or open this game will be compared to Breath of the Wild. I'm sure it's going to be a very open game, but it might have some more linear elements, considering what we've heard with the voice of Ganondorf and what's going on with Zelda and some of the cutscenes we've seen from the trailers. This may have more of a story-driven game. There may be some more linear elements. And I say this because it's entirely possible that we may start the game without the ability to go underwater, but who's to say they can't give us a power-up later on? Adding power-ups later on to give us access to other areas is a linear style of gameplay, which is why I talked about it for an open style game like Tears of the Kingdom, because we didn't see a lot of new power-ups in Breath of the Wild because of how open it was. However, there were some. There were the champion abilities, and while these champion abilities just made it easier to do things, they still were power-ups that were added throughout the game, and also there was the Zora armor that gave us the ability to climb rivers. So similar to previous Zelda games where we obtained some sort of item, be it a Zora tunic or iron boots or even the recent Zora armor with Breath of the Wild, why can't we get some sort of item or power-up that gives us the ability to go underwater later on to the game? We don't know how it'll be structured. There could be power-ups there. And what's interesting about this is that looking at the 4 power-ups we have, they never show Link switching between them. There could be more. Even if we don't get all of them at first, what if there are open slots there that hint at more? They intentionally didn't show us that for whatever reason. And on top of that, we have seen multiple runes associated with Tears of the Kingdom that may be power-ups like what we saw with the 4 in the most recent footage. But with the 4 icons for the different power-ups, we only see a rune for one. The others are using different designs. So we pretty much already have pretty good evidence that there are more power-ups to come. One of those could have to do with underwater exploration. Possibly. But I want to focus on the Ascend ability, because this Ascend ability, I think, is really where it suggests that underwater exploration is going to be a thing. And that's actually for a couple reasons. The less important reason is because when we take a look at the animation, it's a diving down animation, except Link dives upwards when he uses Ascend. He swims through mountains, which is insane. So if we can swim through mountains, why can't we swim through water? Especially if they already have the animation. Considering that we could already interact with objects and creatures in the water, there were environments already fully designed or mostly designed underwater, and that there's an animation for underwater diving and swimming, we have already observed a fair bit of preliminary work for underwater exploration. And I'll also note that the extra stuff we're seeing from what Link may be able to do in the sky based on what they briefly show in the footage and from patents, if there's all these different things we can do in the sky that have a full range of motion, they may also be able to give us some quality gameplay underwater as well. if they found a way to make it fun to have a full range of motion in the air, then they may have also found a way to do it underwater as well. That's one of the reasons why underwater exploration isn't very fun, because you have this full range of motion, you're not grounded, camera work can get a little confusing. But from what we've seen in the sky stuff, they might be able to pull it off. But like I said, this is just a little point. There is still a much bigger point centered around the Ascend ability. So let me just point out that the Ascend ability is all about finding ceilings above you that you can look up and swim straight through vertically and reach the very top and surface out of it. So with this in mind, let's now take a look at what happens at the very end of the footage when Link is diving down into the river. When Link dives down, he doesn't have the ability to ascend, but once he breaks through the water and is underwater, you'll notice that the Ascend ability is active. It's lit up. Until he reaches the surface again, it fades out. The Ascend ability works to get you through the surface, and the fact that it's lit up when you're underwater, what it implies is that the game understands the surface of the water as a ceiling that you can emerge out of. And the implication being that there will be scenarios in the game where you can use the Ascend ability from underwater to bring yourself up to the surface of said water. I think this strongly supports the idea that underwater exploration is absolutely going to be a thing in Tears of the Kingdom, and I think the reason they didn't show it off really just comes down to the fact that that just was not the focus this time around. They didn't show us underground either. These are whole other realms of exploration that will be showed off at a different time, and it may be the case that Link will need some type of power-up to be able to breathe underwater. Just because he can go underwater doesn't mean he can survive there, so he may receive a nice little item from a Zora friend at some point or another. But that's why I have high hopes for underwater exploration in Tears of the Kingdom. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.